Greetings. My name is Rasool Nafisi, and in this presentation I'll try to elucidate some aspects of Iranian perception of Israel and the image of Israel in Iran before and after the revolution, by focusing on intellectual writers as well as religious authorities, and to see if I can find a fairly impartial analysis of this process and the conceptualization of the country. I have focused largely on the writings and the speeches on various religious authorities and some of the authorship among the intellectuals before and after the revolution. And primarily I like to remind the audience that after the declaration of independence by the State of Israel in May 14, 1948, Iran was the second country to recognize Israel as an independent state and the first Muslim country to do so, while Arab Muslim countries waged war against the country. And in fact, recognition of Iran happened right in the middle of those hostilities. It doesn't seem, the recognition of the State of Israel does not seem to have provoked any opposition sentiment, at least at the very beginning of it, except some people accused Iran of, or the Prime Minister saw it, of being bribed. But overall, the recognition went smoothly until the opposition by the religious authorities began to surface. This opposition was spearheaded by Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani, who had spent a good part of his life in Iraq, and he was known for provocation against the British occupation, and he has spent years of his life in exile, and in close association with Abul Qasim Mirlohi or Nawab Safavi, a young firebrand cleric who has spent also some years in Najaf in Iraq as a religious student, and had traveled to some other countries and evidently had met some of the leaders of Muslim Brotherhood. These two individuals were quite influential in the religious space of Iran, and their cooperation and opposition to Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh is well known, and in the process of nationalization of Iranian oil, Kashani seems to have played a role, at least at the very beginning, but then according to Gazrovsky's book, he seems to have received $10,000 from the American agents, and changes his heart against Prime Minister Mossadegh. Now, the opposition that he maintained to British authorities might have been to some extent imbued by his close association with some German authorities. Now, for Kashani to oppose the recognition of Israel, we need to add one more factor, and that was a letter from Al-Azhar University who asked Kashani to help withdrawing the recognition. So in this particular process, we can see how the opposition ideology was largely influenced by the Arab opposition and Arab discourse on Israel. This opposition also was sort of maintained by the nationalist elements in Iran, like Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister, and some other less-known people like Hossein Maleki, who wrote articles against the recognition of Israel. And as we know, once Prime Minister Mossadegh rose to power, one of the first things he did was to withdraw recognition of the State of Israel. Prime Minister Mossadegh was toppled a couple of years later, and the relationship with the State of Israel was reestablished. So we can see that elements of clergy or religious authorities and elements of nationalist movement oppose Israel for different reasons. To the religious authorities, Israel was perceived as a occupier of Muslim lands and as a entity that will cause trouble for Muslims forever, as Ayatollah Kashani wrote in his statement. He staged demonstrations against recognition of Israel, and evidently 30,000 people showed up, although he was not allowed to speak. But another cleric, Muhammad Taqi Falsafi, gave a very fiery speech, and so on and so forth. But on the other side of the aisle, we have secular and independent intellectuals, some of them quite influential, like Jalal al-Ahmad or Darish Ashuri or Hossein Malek, and they were all members of a splinter group from the Communist Party, Tudeh, and the splinter group was called the Society of Socialists, or the Third Force, and to them the most important thing was indigenous idea of socialism and development. This particular ideology was important to understand their pro-Israel stance, and in fact they were invited to Israel, and the list of guests included Jalal al-Ahmad, Darish Ashuri, and Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, who later became the first president of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Iranian security agency, or SAVAK, interfered, did not allow some of them to go, but eventually some did. And upon coming back, they wrote glaring reports about the state of Israel. The very famous pamphlet or book by Jalal al-Ahmad on Israel is full of appreciation and support for a country that is based on indigenous growth and development and leads the way for other countries in the Middle East. In the words of Jalal al-Ahmad, Israel was the New East. I need to explain this concept in the jargon and literature of Jalal al-Ahmad. Jalal al-Ahmad is well known for his popularization of the term Westoxication. And overall, he was a vehement opponent of Westernization of the world. And to him, the East had a certain mission for humanity, and Islam also as an ideology, not as much as a religion, had some authenticity. And to Jalal al-Ahmad, who was a former communist and later on a modified Marxist, these ideas intermingled with his upbringing as the son of a cleric and a devout religious person. So he was somewhere between religiosity and Marxism, and eventually, of course, as we know, religiosity sort of took over, and he went to visit Ayatollah Khomeini and paid allegiance to him and kissed his hands. And the reason was that al-Ahmad perceived Ayatollah Khomeini and Shiism as an indigenous way of liberating Iran. And it is interesting that to know that al-Ahmad in his book explained Israel as an alternative to the archaic and brutal regimes in the Middle East, and he foresaw a future where Israel will be an agent of change and to wake up the Arab leaders, the corrupt Arab leaders, according to him, from their medieval slumber, and create a new situation, a new world in the Middle East. And to him, Israel was the future to grasp. But as I explained before, later on, especially after the 6 Days War in 1967, he seemed to have changed his mind, and he became more and more religious, or close to religious authorities. I shouldn't say religious, because he did not ever become a religious or religion practitioner. But as I said, looking at Shiism as an indigenous form of ideology, he became closer to Ayatollah Khomeini, and he recanted and he wrote another pamphlet denouncing Israel entirely. Another noteworthy intellectual, remarkable thinker that wrote, or not only wrote articles but also gave speeches about Israel, was Dariush Ashuri. And Ashuri, in his article, explained Israel as the new Czechoslovakia in the middle of barbarism of the Arab lands, and in his extremely somewhat racist arguments against Arabs, again he saw a future where these ignorant leaders of Arab countries will succumb to the light of science and enlightenment coming from this part of the world. And to Dariush Ashuri, the existence of Israel and its success in war against Arabs was the triumph of modernity against medievalism and barbarity. He went even so far as saying if Arabs had won the war against Israel, they would have put them all to sword. So to Dariush Ashuri, whose dichotomy of modernity and tradition is well known, Israel was an agent of modernity, and so therefore praiseworthy from a person who was all for modernity. Now we can see similar writings by members of the Society of Socialists like Hossein Malek and others, and they were more impressed by the agricultural innovation of Israel, because a good number of them were actually engineers and agronomists, and they look at the innovation technologies in Israel as a method to be used in the rest of the Middle East. Now, we don't have much more discourse on the state of Israel because it was not allowed one way or another in Iran under the Shah, and so we don't know really what the feelings were, for example, for the middle class, for the lower class, or others. The only expressions we find, as I said, are largely by the religious authorities like Kashani or the socialists. By 1979, we have the success of Iranian clerical class to create a new Shiite state, and a good number of them, like Ayatollah Montazeri and Khomeini and Motahari, were already vehement critics and enemies of the state of Israel. And in the minds of clergy, I need to explain that a state of Israel was associated with the Baha'is, who they hated. They hated Baha'i faith. They associated Israel with the United States and modernity, both of those who they hated. So in this picture, clearly, once the new Iranian state came to power, considering the good number of its founders had been trained by the PLO and imbued by Muslim Brotherhood ideologies, it was predictable that they will have a hostile relationship with the state of Israel. The paradigm shift occurred not only for recognition of Israel that was abruptly canceled, but also for the Iranian Jews. Iranian Jewry was divided into two right away, or the whole Jewish world was divided into two. One, the Zionist Jews that were the enemy, and the second part was the Jewish people who were, according to Quran, were protected, and therefore protected status, of course, was suffered for millennia by the Jewish people, and they had gained a nationhood, or I would say loosely citizenship, after the Reza Shah coup against Qajars, and it came to zenith under the second Shah, Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, and I would say those years were the golden years for the Jewish people in Iran. Now all of those were taken away, and although Jewish leaders went to visit Ayatollah Khomeini to convince him that they were for him, but the hostility that was embedded in the speeches of Khomeini and others scared a good number of Iranian Jews, and they saw the writing on the wall, and in a few years the Jewish population of Iran declined and reduced from 100,000 to about 25 to 30,000. Now, if you look at the scenario, you can imagine the type of writing of the Iranian authorities against Israel. Ayatollah Khomeini was not going to settle for anything less than destruction of Israel. He did not even make clear that in this destruction also Israeli Arabs were or were not included. Ayatollah Montazeri made some exceptions, and Ayatollah Motahari in his writings and speeches looked at Israel as Satan incarnate, and he basically said in so many words that Jews are a very smart group of people, or a smart race, as he put it, and they are expert in manipulation of others, and they have the arteries of the world, economic and cultural, and obviously these ideas came from Europe, not very indigenous to Iran. Ayatollah Khamenei is an interesting case, because I need to mention that Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, as a young cleric, was a fan of Jalal al-Ahmad. And if you listen carefully to his speeches and his conceptualization of political and social reality, you can still find the traces of the ideas of Fardid, who was the person who inspired Jalal al-Ahmad with the idea of stochastication, and al-Ahmad himself. And you can see how he frames, Ayatollah Khamenei frames his ideas in al-Ahmadian terminologies. Now, it is interesting that now this new leader, at the time who was a devout follower of al-Ahmad, as a young cleric or religious student, he was very disappointed by the book of al-Ahmad about Israel, and he even traveled from Mashhad to Tehran to tell him how much he was disappointed, but he didn't get much of a straight answer, according to Ayatollah Khamenei. But in the last part of my talk, I want to explain a sociological or social psychology factor that in Iran under the Shah, opposition to Israel or to any authority that helped the Shah came from this idea that Shah is the most corrupt, and anybody who helps him being in the United States or Israel or anybody would be rejected. So, in other words, because the United States and Israel were allies of the Shah of Iran, they were the target of hatred by a good number of nationalists and even socialists because of the association with the United States, and of course religious class. Now, this particular situation explains how the ideas emerged after the Islamic Revolution. We don't have much clear indication of whether or not Iranian people are pro or con when it comes to Israel. But some statistics that were allowed show that a good number of Iranians, about 72%, were pro United States and preferred a relationship with the United States. And we can say by indication that probably the same size of population support a better relationship with Israel. On the religious class, there are few but scanty indication of the change of heart. The best, I think, is Ayatollah Montazeri's memoirs and interviews. In one of his last interviews with the foreign media, Ayatollah Montazeri said clearly that yes, the Palestinians were suppressed vehemently by the Israelis, but now what do you want to do with millions of Jews living in that part of the world? He said even some people from Isfahan, meaning his hometown, even some people from Isfahan have migrated to Israel. What do you want to do? You want to throw them all into the ocean? This is very important to hear from Ayatollah Montazeri, who at one point spearheaded the opposition to Israel and the organization that he sort of inspired, the organization for the liberation movement of Islamic countries, or Islamic liberation movement, that he inspired, and his close associate Mehdi Hashemi commanded, was headed for the destruction of Israel and creating opposition groups across the Levant. Now, the same person is coming to the conclusion that Israel is an entity to stay, and in all fairness, he seems to have changed his heart about a lot of things on the positive way. I finished my talk by referring to the Iranian maverick professor Sadiq Zibakalam, and Sadiq Zibakalam is known for his controversial statements, and in one of his, or maybe more than one of his debates with pro-regime intellectuals and journalists, he said in so many words that we, meaning Iranians, seems to say that we have the mandate to destroy Israel. But who gave us this mandate? Why have we made opposition to Israel the main pivot of our foreign policy? And he says at the end, I recognize Israel because Israel is recognized by the United Nations. No need to say that provoked a lot of opposition from the regime and religious intellectuals, but I think what Saad al-Kalam said shows a predominant feeling that exists in Iran and was expressed in the slogan in 2009 uprising, and that was not Palestine, not Lebanon, and I give my life for Iran. Thank you very much for listening.